Hello and welcome to Stress-Free Longevity. This is episode 16 and I'm talking with Professor Emilie, Combet, a nutrition scientist from the University of Glasgow. In this interview we tackle the big topics in nutrition, discuss practical approaches to healthy eating that cuts through the nutrition noise, and focus on what really matters for long-term health. There's a lot to discuss. Let's jump right in. Well, we are clearly living within an epidemic of obesity, the era of obesity, and I guess cardiometabolic disease, which is related to that.
Mm-hmm.
So just very broadly speaking, what's your take on that? Why has this epidemic arisen?
It's interesting because if we look at prevalence of obesity across all westernized countries, but globally as well, it is growing, and this is directly related with what we do, how we do it. Of course, there's an individual portion to that, but really it's the societies we live in that really dictate what we do and how we do it. And a big proportion of why people live with obesity is their genes. There's a strong genetic component, but that genetic component is fueled, if you want, by the environment that we create, that our society puts in front of us. And we're in a society where food is everywhere, in different forms and shapes. I've always found it quite interesting to see chocolate bars, for example, at the pharmacy. That's a concept that I've never quite understood why we do that, but there is a structural part on why we behave in a certain way, and that's what society puts in front of us, and that's really concerning because to some extent it's not fair to speak about willpower when we live in a world that sets us up to behave in certain ways, and those ways are going to drive the obesity prevalence that we see in the UK and elsewhere.
So we like to start these interviews with a little bit of science, if that's okay. So let's talk about macronutrients. There seems to be such a war, and camps develop, the high protein and then the low sugar. And that has clearly led to a lot of confusion, a lot of different diets, and I think, general confusion amongst the public. Big topic, very broad, but just what would you like to say on macronutrients and maybe why they're important and what would be a sensible approach to each?
So in terms of macronutrients, we've got carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And fats is a big family. There's different types of fats. Carbohydrates, very big family, different type of carbohydrates. And they're all really important in sustaining life. I mean, first of all, we need energy to kind of function on a daily basis. And we also need those building blocks that are going to enable building muscles, keeping muscles kind of going, sustaining brain function, and all our body's functions. In terms of how much, and that's always a question, well, how much, which proportion should we consume? There are various guidelines and recommendations and dietary goals. So in Scotland, we've got the Scottish dietary goals that tells us, well, we should eat so much of those, so much of those. And ultimately, some people disagree about that, about whether carbohydrates should be such a big part of our diet. And I think some of the confusion comes from the fact that carbohydrate is a very big family of macronutrients. We've got the simple sugars, free sugars. We've got the more complex ones that may be important, for example, for gut health. So if we're thinking about certain forms of starch, they're going to be really important there. We also have the question of fiber, which obviously we don't eat enough of. So it's quite difficult. And there are some people who support a low carbohydrate diet, and they think that metabolically it's better. There are some pitfalls with such restrictive diets, mostly because with carbohydrates or carbohydrate-rich products, we've got a lot of macronutrients. Same with fats, to be honest. There's a lot of macronutrients linked to fats. And the minute you start excluding one of those groups, you're potentially impacting on the intake of those associated other nutrients.
So sometimes I find it, I don't know if others listening will nod along and share this opinion, but I sometimes find when we break it down into proportions of macronutrients, I find that kind of complicated. Because
It's
then
not
that's
particularly helpful, is it?
no, it's going to require a lot of like calculating. So tell us about just food groups. Would there be even a kind of more sensible approach in terms of just ensuring that you have certain food groups in your diet in a week that would be healthy?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's some guidelines available. There's the food guidelines. In the UK, we've got the Eat Well guide, which has been declined in different versions that are maybe culturally sensitive and appropriate. The big group is fruit and vegetables, 5 portions. I think that's a well integrated message and ensuring that a lot of those fruit and veg uh, are consumed every day. Not necessarily fresh, it could be from a tin or frozen peas, that counts as well. It doesn't have to be all fresh. That's the big group. Second big group is the carbohydrate, the starchy foods, let's say, which include your rice, your pasta, your whole grain. And that's quite interesting, not only because they're nice and enjoyable and part of our normative UK diet, but also because some of those are potentially fortified as well with, for example, B vitamins. So there is something in there that maybe we do not think about, but it is quite important. Then you've got your protein. Protein, of course, people think meat, fish, dairy, but it also includes things like soy or chickpeas or lentils, eggs that maybe are not so much associated with protein food, but in fact, they are good sources of protein. And then you've got your dairy and dairy alternatives. So that would be your cow's milk, but also the soy plant-based type drinks that replace cow's milk for people who don't consume animal product, your cheese and so on. Obviously, this is should be less of a high proportion of diets. There's a lot of calories in fat and also sometimes a lot of sodium in cheese. So it's important not to kind of over consume. And then we've got the things that we add to food to prepare them. So oil, butter, spread, depending on what there is. Water is the drink that is recommended usually, not juice particularly, or coffee, tea, or wine. Although coffee, tea, and so on will contribute to this kind of fluid intake overall. And then there's a bit that is not represented in the Eat Well guide, and that's all the extra little things like the crisps, the biscuits, the snacks, and those should be eaten only as a special treat. They are not part of your day-to-day diet, and they're often high in fat, sugar, and salts. Things that we're trying to reduce in the day-to-day diet, especially in the context of reducing obesity.
So I'm going to touch on a few topics which seem to cause a lot of controversy. I was just curious what your opinion is on these particular topics. So the first one is plant-based versus animal-based. There's big camps here. Is there a consensus? Do you think there's more of a sensible approach to this, or do you think one is looking stronger or more preferable than the other?
I don't think it's an easy one to tackle, but I guess plant-based alternatives, whether they are plant-based alternatives to milk or plant-based alternative to a burger or a product like that, I think they're really useful, especially for people who aim to reduce animal foods, animal produce in their diet. It doesn't mean just people who follow a vegan diet. It means also people who are quite interested in reducing the level of meat and dairy they consume, maybe not totally, but to some extent, because plant-forward diets, we know that they're good for the health of the planet, the climate is something we should all strive toward, and the plant-based alternative are there to maybe replace the burger we would usually eat or the pint of milk we would usually drink. To some extent, they don't always 100% match the nutritional composition of, for example, the milk. So a pint of cow's milk is going to be a great way to secure, for example, iodine, okay, a nutrient that we don't consume enough of usually in the UK. But not all plant-based milk are going to be fortified with iodine. So you don't have a like-for-like match. And depending on what's in the carton, you might be missing out on one micronutrient. Saying this, for some people, it's not a problem because maybe they get their iodine from something else. The problem is it's not necessarily super intuitive to replace the animal product for the plant-based product because sometimes they haven't been fortified to match the original product. There's a bigger question on whether we really do we need a plant-based burger? Does a plant-based product need to resemble an animal-based product? Do we need that for the way we feel about our diet? And that's a bigger question. But ultimately, those products are there. They all have gone through quite a level of processing. Some people object to that processing level, but they are an important tool to make sure that we can move the dial toward a greater proportion of the population adopting this plant-forward diet.
Can I ask you about vegetables versus fruits? You often hear vegetables are better than fruits. Have you a strong opinion, or again, is it just everything in balance?
I think everything in balance. Obviously, you're going to have a lot more natural sugar in the fruit compared to the vegetable. There's some really interesting kind of bioactives in fruit and vegetable, depending on what they are. So, for example, if you think about your Jerusalem artichoke, it's going to be full of prebiotics, really interesting nutritionally. That prebiotic is not going to be the same level in an apple. So they're all very different in their own ways. Blueberries are going to be really rich in polyphenolics, which are also really interesting for health. Not the same level in the banana or cucumber, for example. Avocado is going to contain really interesting fiber levels that are maybe not found in your, I don't know, your lettuce. So they all do vary in terms of the bioactives and the beneficial component that they bring, and having a diversity is really important. So there's consuming 5 a day, and that's both vegetable and fruit, but also a diversity because they all bring something quite unique in their own ways, and varying across the week, across the days, what we eat is really important in that reason.
The quantity of food we eat and the calorie consumption, is that a big part of this? What can we say about calories? Is it simply calories in, calories out, or is it way more complicated?
It's a complicated discussion, and it links back to what we were discussing about whether we should have low carbohydrate diets or not. In terms of how much, how many calories, how much energy should we consume, there are guidelines for men, for women, in order to kind of maintain a healthy weight. I think the complication is monitoring those calories, even though you might use a tracker on your phone to find out how many calories you eat. It's all very dependent on whether you feel full and happy and content with what you've consumed. And this regulation is sometimes tricky for some people. Um, Measuring those calories is hard. We know that the texture of food, the density of food is going to affect how full we feel and how likely we are to eat again. So there is something to say about your raw vegetable, your food, and how it's going to make you feel full. And that's going to be a big part of the equation. There's some interesting research coming up about how certain type of food, depending on how it's processed, make you feel less sated and content with what you've eaten. And I think that's an interesting part. Is it as simple as calorie in, calorie out? Potentially not. But ultimately, energy balance is critical. And as an individual, it's very difficult to monitor the exact number of calories we consume. I mean, to some extent, some people will be really tracking hard, really trying to see where they are. And that's a really useful approach, but it's never super precise or accurate. And it's very much linked to fullness and feeling well in oneself after a meal and not having this desire to eat again. And food volume plays a big role in that because to some extent it distends the stomach and sends signals to the brain saying, well, you've eaten enough, you're full now.
So that leads me on nicely to my next question, which was about appetite. And I guess the new weight loss drugs have maybe brought that very much into people's minds at the moment. So tell us a little bit, what's the basics of appetite and fullness, and how important is that for us?
So, I mean, appetite is wanting to eat, is a desire to eat, and it's influenced by biological factors and psychological factor. It's not hunger, it's a desire to eat. And we've got various hormones. Our brain also signals to us when we are in a state of wanting to eat, and it's affected by various things like our energy stores, our blood sugar levels, and also what's happening in our gut, our gastrointestinal activity. But what's happening around us can also trigger appetite, for example, emotions or being bored or being stressed, or social cues, maybe advertising as well, and also things like smelling something whilst we walk down the street. The smell is going to trigger something in our brain that is going to then tell us that we want to eat, we desire to eat. And it can really be shaped by those kind of environmental and cultural factors as well. So it's quite different from hunger, but it's to some extent linked to it. And it's also linked to satiety, the feeling of fullness. And usually when we feel full and sated, that suppresses appetite and this desire to eat. We've had enough, and that's the stop signal. And I think that was something that I found really interesting with the development of those new drugs, is that we've started to speak a lot more about the different lived experience around appetite and desire to eat or desire to stop eating, and the notion of food noises. And I think that's something that we potentially didn't discuss quite as much beforehand, and very exciting development.
Naturally, it would be probably more ideal to influence our appetite and our feelings of fullness, and maybe to modify how much we eat naturally instead of using medication and the new weight loss drugs. What are other kind of more natural ways to influence that satiety kind of pathway?
There's different ways to do that. There's some good evidence around eating fiber-rich meals or foods, also protein-rich meals or foods, and eating smaller meals across the day as ways to kind of really improve appetite and regulate appetite across a period. So those are interesting approaches. There's some really interesting evidence behind it, and it's potentially thinking about the cues that the meal environment, how we consume food, and being mindful about the food we eat. In particular, for example, eating on the go is not necessarily conducive to mindful eating. So it's thinking about that, but whether those are going to suppress appetite to the level that the new drugs do suppress appetite, it is unlikely.
So these new drugs obviously seem very exciting, but I would have a bit of concern from a medical perspective, and I know people are using them who maybe shouldn't be off license or whatever, and presumably fasting, not eating, will come with potential side effects too. Would there be a general concern? Who are these drugs for, and could you ever see them being used in, I guess, smaller doses or whatever for more general public use rather than the obese or diabetics?
So there's a very clear kind of remit for these drugs to be used as obesity treatments and type 2 diabetes treatments, and there is no support for them to be used in the normal weight population. That's not what they're here for. And I guess the concern would be is, imagine you've got a dietary intake which is markedly reduced, your appetite has gone down, your desire to eat has waned, you're now consuming maybe a smaller amount altogether, or maybe a different type of food altogether. Maybe you are off your usual food type and you're starting to consume another one, there's potentially an impact on the type of proteins that you eat, the types of fats that you eat, and altogether the micronutrients that you consume. And long term, that may have some quite significant consequences on your metabolism, your general health and well-being. And if you're at a critical period of life, so for example, you're a woman of reproductive age, not everyone plans their pregnancy, that can be potentially quite a big concern. So in an ideal world, everyone who goes on to using those drugs gets super high quality dietetic support so that they really have someone there telling them, well, those are the choices that you can make. Be careful about this. You're maybe not getting enough of, for example, fiber or certain micronutrients. Those are the right strategies to kind of gain what you're not consuming or missing. And then if those people do come off the drugs at some point, there is someone there to really accompany them in making the choices when they go back to eating food and without the support of the drugs. And that's a critical part. It's not a forever solution. You take the drugs and you're cured and you can go back to do anything, everything without the disease still being there. Obesity is a disease. It comes back. It's like hypertension. You stop taking the drug, the blood pressure goes back up. Well, obesity is the same, and having this high quality support is critical.
What do you think of fasting in general? It's very popular now, very fashionable. It kind of makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. I presume we didn't always live in abundance for millions of years and probably had periods of, scarcity and perhaps that I can see the logic in that having a health advantage. What's your kind of take on that subject?
I think whenever we look back at the faraway past, there's always a rose-tinted glasses kind of view. But I think we need to remember that all those years past, we didn't live much past the age of 40. So to some extent, our health trajectories were somewhat shorter. But I think you're right. Historically, there wasn't this food all the time everywhere and this cost of living crisis. We know that many people struggle to afford good food or enough food on a daily basis, but nevertheless, our society puts food out all the time, everywhere, if not in your plate, on billboards. Fasting in that context makes sense. Feeling hunger is normal. It's good to have those feelings, to remember why we eat, to have this reason to eat. So hunger increases, appetite increases, and we want to eat. How we do it and for how long we do it has different consequences. There's your daily fast. Some people eat only once a day, so one meal a day. There's some interesting impact on weight management. For some people, it doesn't work for everyone. Some people fast for longer. I think the main concern when we speak about fasting is it sustainable? Is it impacting any critical component of the diet, for example, micronutrients? Is it creating a deficit that might be difficult to correct? And is it likely to have a long-term consequence? And the long-term consequence could be for the person themselves. But if we think again of women who may become pregnant shortly or less shortly after, does this then impact the pregnancy, the next pregnancy? Because we build micronutrient stores and they are there at conception. To some extent, depleting those stores can have an impact on the health of the unborn baby. So it's thinking about it in a life course context. And I guess if we think about later on in life, at the point in life where we get older and our muscle mass decreases, we need to be careful about those approaches to fasting that may lead to a rapid weight loss, which would automatically impact on the muscle compartment. Thinking about strategies to mitigate that, maybe combining the fasting with resistance exercise to make sure that this muscle mass is preserved, muscle function is preserved. And again, that requires a high level of knowledge and know-how. So again, having the support, being accompanied whilst one engages in fasting is really important.
Now, the new fashionable topic is the microbiome. Have you any kind of way to summarize that for someone who maybe isn't familiar with this topic?
So, super important. I think it's a really exciting topic, an area of research, and big opportunity for the field in terms of developing strategies that support health, but also um, support the treatment of specific diseases. And to sum it up, is basically a very diverse community of microorganisms, bacteria, but not only, there's fungi, there's yeasts living in our gut. And the gut is really from the mouth all the way to large intestine, the rectum. So it's the full kind of the full pipe, basically. There's some bacteria in our mouth that are really important in, for example, processing some of the bioactives that we eat. For example, if we consume nitrate rich foods, they're going to impact and be important. The one that we always hear about is the microbiome in our gut, in our large intestine, and they're really important in processing things, bioactive molecules that are not absorbed further up in the gut and land there in the colon. And the bacteria are going to be hard at work. They can break down those bioactive much better than us or human body can. And they're going, by breaking down those larger compounds, they're going to release smaller, really metabolically interesting molecules. For example, from certain type of fibers, they're going to produce short-chain fatty acids, and those short-chain fatty acids are very small molecules who are going to be able to pass into the blood, reaches various organs and receptors, and trigger all sorts of metabolic cascades that are really important. And similarly, we were talking earlier on about the blueberries and the polyphenolics. Well, those polyphenolics, they're quite large molecules. We can't absorb them. So they go all the way down to the colon. They land there with the bacteria, and the bacteria get to work, chop them in smaller active molecules that then can get absorbed and go and do their work. For example, mitigating inflammatory processes and that kind of thing. So really exciting. And then those little molecules go and eliminate certain pathways and modulate things like inflammation, but also potentially appetite. There's a really interesting gut-brain axis area of research that looks at what the microbiome does and produces, and how those products kind of go and change what happens in our body.
And there's quite a few people now that seem to believe that even the microbiome is potentially a huge contributor to some of these epidemics that we're now seeing. Tell us a little bit more about that, about how the microbiome is influencing our health and our cardiometabolic health in particular.
I guess the first very obvious place is the gut itself. So the types of microbiomes are associated with inflammatory diseases in the gut. So, for example, Crohn's disease. There's a lot of research, really exciting research on that. But something that is, again, often forgotten, the microbiome starts in the mouth. And we know that there's very strong links between periodontitis, a disease in the mouth that involves bacteria, and heart disease, endocarditis. So, to some extent, there is almost a connection between us and the bacteria. And if the bacteria breach the barrier, for example, with periodontitis, there is a really big increase in inflammation, and that leads to very well-established diseases. So that's a really interesting kind of area, because to some extent, what you eat can modulate the populations of the types of bacteria in the microbiome, maybe suppressing some that are less good and increasing the diversity of some that are so-called better bacteria, and that might change the outcome of certain conditions. So that's really interesting. Now, what exactly do you need to eat to do this fine-tuning is a big question, and there's various approaches with probiotics, prebiotics, certain levels of certain components to try to kind of regulate. Ultimately, we all have a microbiome at the start, depending on the type of birth our mothers went through, depending on our upbringing, whether we were playing in the dirt outside a lot or not. And that microbiome that we start with has got quite a strong identity. And shifting it from what it was when we were little is not always that easy. You can't just kind of redesign your microbiome just like that. Also, there is quite a lot of emerging research in fecal transplantation, that kind of things. But looking at diet specifically, if you want to tweak your microbiome, you're going to shift it a bit. But often it goes back to its natural state, its natural distribution, if you want.
It's impossible to have a nutrition talk without ultra processed foods. Again, demonized a bit in some circles, but hard to ignore that in this modern diet, industrialized production seems certainly from a timing perspective to coincide with some of the issues that we're facing. But what would be a pragmatic approach to ultra processed foods? Are they as much of a concern as some would believe, and why would they be a concern?
So I don't like the term. I do not want to call foods ultra processed food, mostly because I think the group is ill defined. There's all sorts of foods that get categorized as ultra processed food, and not everyone agrees on whether food X is ultra processed or just the level below processed, but not so much processed. And I don't like the fact it's such a heterogeneous bunching of stuff together. And I also think that is quite a privileged take on what is good and what is bad. And I don't think that it's ever useful to categorize food as good or bad, because depending on your circumstances and your context, something that you might think of bad might become quite useful. And I'm thinking of an example where if you're living in great food scarcity, I think you're quite happy to find a tin of baked beans. And I don't eat baked beans, but I would be quite happy to eat them, I'm sure, if I was in a very sticky situation. But ultimately, I think there's a lot of really compelling observational evidence about the association between what people call UPF, ultra processed foods, and various kind of health outcomes or conditions, diseases, and so on. But it's potentially, because it's such a broad categories in there, you've got things like sugar sweetened beverages, so your sodas and so on. You've got your cakes, your chocolate and confectionery. You've got things that are maybe less obvious, like your supermarket bread, baked bean, fish fingers, that are an important way to kind of eat white fish. And a lot of the projects that we spoke about before, the plant-based alternative, there's no saying that those are going to be going through a high level of processing in order to be what they are, especially when we want to make sure that those fortified food contains all the micronutrients and vitamins that we need. We need to add those, we need to fortify. So is there good evidence? There's good observational evidence. There's some emerging interventions testing whether eating a diet rich in those food versus less processed foods is going to impact health outcome. I'd like to see a little bit more evidence, interventional evidence first, and ultimately I think I prefer to focus on the HFSS definition, so foods high in fat, sugar, and salt, which I think is a useful way to really restrict the definition to what we would identify as less desirable, so crisps, chocolate, biscuits. We know that those are not amazing for health. Any other form of processing, I'm not convinced yet that there is a genuine impact on health.
I'm just going to touch on another few little topics that seem to raise their head quite a lot. The first one is organic food. Is it necessary? I know it's not practical for everyone or most people, but is it ever helpful, or what's your take on that?
So it comes with a higher price tag. And that's a problem for many people, especially if it means that they cannot buy something else which is important for them or for their health. There is good evidence that it's good for biodiversity, for the planet. From a health perspective, I am not aware of any conclusive kind of research that has demonstrated that organic food was superior to non-organic food, just from a health perspective. So my concern would be, well, this evidence is lacking. It's got a high price tag. If we want to support a planet which is healthy, a healthy planet, we need to make the choices that are going to support that. But it goes back to trade-offs. What do you do when your finances are limited? And I think we really need to think about those people whose finances are limited. Who needs to make the choice toward organic? Should it be the people with limited means, or should it be everyone else? And I don't think that's being explored enough.
Is frozen food as good as non-frozen? And you see it a lot in the supermarkets now. There's really great array of frozen food, which seems
Mhm.
super practical, less waste, a lot of benefits. Just curious about nutritionally, is it equivalent?
So are we talking about frozen vegetables, not prepared?
Yes, like ingredients, single
Yeah,
ingredient,
yeah.
just frozen at source.
So the great thing about frozen vegetables, let's say frozen peas, is that nutritionally they're as good as what you would find in the fresh counter, with the added advantage that they are pre-prepared, so there's a time advantage as well. Um, they're also snap frozen pretty much very close to harvest, whereas the ones that you find fresh on the shelves have maybe sat there for couple of days or more. So the frozen version is as good nutritionally as the fresh version. Of course, you've got to have a freezer and the electricity to kind of keep the freezer running, so that might influence your choice. But from a nutritional point of view, they are as good as.
Do you have any strong opinion on supplements? Supplements are, oh my God, they're everywhere. We seem to be obsessed with supplements. I mean, if you're not deficient and you're leading us a reasonably healthy diet, are they ever necessary, or are they simply probably useful for people who are known deficient in some micronutrient or not?
So it's true that the people who tend to buy and consume multivitamins, micronutrients, are often the people who are worried well, people who have enough money to buy those things and are quite worried about their diet. They're rarely the people who actually need them. There's one type of supplement that is recommended to be taken in the winter months, and that's vitamin D, especially in Scotland. But again, I don't know many people who do take it religiously every day. So vitamin D is recommended. Otherwise, I think it very much depends on the diet and how restrictive it is. In the absence of a clinical diagnosis, for example, an iron deficiencies that would call for some sort of a supplementation. I think for the everyday people, one key thing is people adopting a vegan diet. B12 supplementation is critical because otherwise it would be lacking. Plus, also potentially micronutrients that are mostly found in animal products. So, for example, iodine, and those are very specific to the vegan diet. Otherwise, in theory, a balanced diet should cover all other micronutrients. Saying this, we know that in the UK diet, micronutrient insufficiencies are quite prevalent. Is it a reason to start taking a multivitamins? I think it's better to consider balancing the diet first before buying all sorts of supplements. Something that's worth thinking about is not so much micronutrients, but fiber supplementation. It's hard to reach the target 30 gram per day of fiber. So there is some supplement or powders available, for example, psyllium husk that can be added onto porridges and that kind of thing. That is maybe worth thinking about. But I think supplementation, as in mindlessly buying multivitamins and taking them every day, is not necessarily indicated in the context of a balanced diet.
Now, I thought I would kind of, as we approach the end, try to kind of put it all together to make maybe even some simple maybe principles, if there is such a thing. I guess the purpose of stress-free longevity for me was to try and uncover a kind of less stressful way to live, but to live healthily. I'm kind of don't want to obsess. I don't want to overthink. I don't want to overcalculate and over, you know. So if I came to you as a professor of nutrition and said, look, I'm probably a little bit overweight, which I probably am, I'd like to live healthily. I'd like to eat healthily without too much obsession, probably losing a bit of weight, but know that I'm, eating a healthy way to live a reasonably healthy life. What would be some key principles, putting all of this together, that you would recommend?
So I think that would be the kind of general advice to people who are not living with a condition, but with a little bit of overweight. I guess the first thing that is lacking for most people, overweight or not, is fiber. Increasing fiber intake, wonderful for gut health, feeds that microbiome, but also impacts on appetite. So that would be my top one. I would say the next big one would be reducing alcohol. It's a problem with for a lot of people, swapping it for a healthier drink, water, tea, kombucha, things that are not too loaded in calories, but especially not alcohol. There's quite a lot of calories in alcohol drinks. And I guess the last one, if I had to have a third one, so fiber, alcohol, I think it would be being mindful of not making great, massive cuts to an entire food group and getting rid of it totally, because there will be unintended consequences on other things like micronutrient intake, which might be quite difficult to correct if they lead to deficiencies.
And just on that, in terms of fiber, any recommendations, any preferred types of food?
Whatever works. Some people enjoy eating baked beans. Obviously, the tin baked beans come in that sauce that is sometimes quite sugary. But lentils, lentil stews, soups, dals, chickpeas, hummus. Obviously, there's quite a lot of fat in hummus, but finding variations around the pulses is quite useful. Avocados have got fiber. Green bananas doesn't appeal to everyone, but green banana has got a type of starch that is not well digested. It goes into the gut. So a diversity of fruit and veg will afford different types of fiber, and altogether it will create a nice amount that you consume. But yeah, beans are an amazing source of fiber. So having them as a staple is a good choice. It also brings some proteins, and they're often quite affordable as well. So winning on all fronts.
Professor Combet, thank you so much for joining me today. I usually finish by just giving the speaker one last opportunity, just for any final messages you'd like to leave us with.
Thank you very much. I think it's particularly important to remember that food is not just for health, for nutrition. It's an identity, it's who we are. And when we're thinking about solutions to go forward, we need to be really careful about not leaving some people behind, especially people who may be living their life by consuming foods that we consider not so good. We don't want to create further stigma, move forward without them, because some choices that we make, for example, in terms of policy, may have massive impact on their health and their well-being. And some of those impacts may not be reversible. So it's particularly important to be mindful about the broad diversity of people who live on our planet, and the fact that there is not one good solution that works for everyone. There's many solutions that work for many different types of people. So we need to be inclusive, and we need to recognize that diversity.
Professor Combet, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
So huge thanks again to Professor Emilie Combet for the interview. I think my key take-home messages are: number one, stop blaming yourself for food struggles. Professor Combet explained that our environment drives eating behaviours more than willpower. We live surrounded by food everywhere, so we are set up to fail. Number 2, forget calculating macronutrients. It's complicated and not helpful. Think simple food groups instead: fruits, vegetables, starchy carbs, protein sources like beans and lentils, with treats as occasional pleasures. Number 3, her top 2 recommendations were increasing fibre and reducing alcohol. Fibre feeds your gut bacteria and impacts appetite, while alcohol packs calories without much benefit. Number 4, Professor Combet doesn't like demonising ultra-processed foods because the category is too broad. Focus on limiting foods high in fat, sugar and salt instead. And finally, number 5, avoid extreme restrictions. Professor Combet warned that eliminating entire food groups can cause unintended micronutrient deficiencies. Each food group provides unique essential nutrients your body needs. Don't forget, you can access lots more content on my social media channels. All of the information can be found at stressfreelongevity.com. Until next time, take care.